So you want to become a Business Central API superhero? Well, this is the video for you. APIs and web services have become an everyday thing for all PC developers. So let's just see how you can get the most out of them. So let's get started. In Business Central, we have two ways of exposing our data to the world. We got API pages and we got the old way of doing it, where you have the web service where you can expose a page or you can expose a query or a data port to expose data to the world. The great thing about API pages is that if it's inside your extension, once the extension has been installed, the API page will automatically be available on the endpoints. So let's just take a little bit of a look about how you create these API pages. Well, an API page is pretty much just a regular page. The only big difference here is that, of course, you have to make it a page type API. And then we have to set some of these API group, API publisher, API version, and also the entity name and the entity set name. These are all the ones that are going to be used when you're building up your query. The great thing here is, of course, with the version is you can show which version that people have to connect to. So if someone is saying something's not working, then they can say, okay, that's because you're connected to the version 1. You should be updated to version 2. And the grouping is they can group everything here. So if I had more APIs, I can put them inside the same group. So once you create your query or your query string, the group would actually be able to put everything together. And pretty much the same with the publisher. It's also a way of grouping, but it's also, of course, to say who has published this, who's responsible for it. Another thing that you have to do when you are working with API pages, you have to create this OData key fields. And here I have used the system ID. And that's a very good practice to always use the system ID whenever possible, because the system ID is a unique key that is always going to be unique no matter whatever you change on the record. You can never change the system ID. So it's a good way to bind systems together. Then something else you have to think about is this data access intent, because this is something to do with performance. If you're using the read only, it means you're actually not querying towards the database itself, but against a replica of the database. And that, of course, if you have a lot of API calls, a lot of web services, it's a good way to offload some of the load that comes into your system. But besides that, it looks very much like any other page. You have the layout and you have the fields that you want to be able to, for people to see data in. Besides that, I have also created a function down here. And this function is what you would call a bound function. Now you have unbound and bound functions. The bound functions are something that is bound towards a given record or a given entity. That means that if I have to call this, I have to first find my item, which is this is based on an item, and then I can call this function. Besides that, I just have to make it service enabled. And that's pretty much all there is to it. We also have this action context, web service action context, where you can return what kind of result this query has created. Besides that, if you look at the unbound actions, we can go to this one over here. We have an unbound action, and as you can see, that's pretty much just a very regular code unit with a regular function. Nothing special is going on here. The only thing is, of course, this has to be published as a web service. Now you can either publish it as a web service by going to the client and going into web services and creating, choosing publish in there, or you can create an XML file like I've created here. And if you create these definitions, then once you publish it or install this extension, it will automatically also publish this web service. So that's a way you can get kind of the same thing as an API page for your web services. So, of course, once we create these web services, let's try to connect to them. Now, in Business Central, we have to start using OAuth as our authentication against API and web services. That means that we have to create an application registration. So if we go to our Azure portal, and then we can go to our home here, and we have app registrations, and we can create a new one. So once we are here on the app registration, we give it a name, we call it test. You keep it as single tenant. Down here, you choose web, and then you set in a URL. I'm using this OAuth landing HTML, but it doesn't really matter what you choose down here. It just has to be some kind of URL. We then press register. This has now created our app registration. Next, we have to set up some permissions. So if we go to our API permissions, and we go to add permission, we go to Business Central, and then we have the dedicated permissions. So let's just choose these. And you have application permissions. Let us also choose these. Press add permissions. You can see now you have them out here. However, as you can see, you need to grant some permissions here. So let's grant admin consent. And yes, I will grant the permissions. Okay, so now that's done. The next thing that we have to do is we have to create a new token in here. So you create a new secret, call it something that you can remember. Or it doesn't matter if you can remember because you don't really need this name, but just call it something that's called test, and it expires in 6 months. Now it's very important that you copy this value, because this is the only time that you're ever going to see it. It's not the end of the world if you don't copy it, because you can always just create a new secret, but it's a good idea to copy this and save it somewhere else. And the next thing is you have to go to your overview, and then we need this application client ID. Now I'll just go to my app registrations over here just to see. I already set this up. So as you can see, I have my app client application here. If we then go to Business Central, and we go to our Azure directory applications, you have to create a new one, so as I did here, and then you have to take the client ID that we copied from over here. You see the same one is written here. Take that, put it inside the client ID, give it a description, and enable it. Once you've done that, you need to add some permissions to this application. I have added administrator and DBS full access. Of course, you should only add the permissions that is needed. You can, however, not add super to this kind of service account. Once those have been added, you have to press the grant consent. This will open up a window where you can grant yourself consent, and you just accept, and it's been successfully granted. So now you're actually good to go. Everything you need to do has been set up in Business Central. So let's just head over to Postman. Now in Postman, we need to set up some authentication, of course. That's the first thing. So if you go to authentication, you choose OAuth, and you go down here to your configure new token, give it a name, client credentials, then enter this URL. Now this is my tenant ID. So this of course has to be changed to your tenant ID. Then you have the client ID, which again was the client ID of your Azure app registration. And this is the secret value that you copied before. So that's where you need that secret value. Then we put this in as a scope. And you can press get new access token. it will then say, okay, you have now gotten a new access token, say proceed, and you can say use this token. And actually I have a couple of tokens here, so let's just do that. So now you have an access token. Next thing is that we need to get our company ID. So by using this endpoint where dev is the name of your sandbox or production environment or whatever environment you got, go into authentication and use your available tokens. I got my demo, and if I press send, it will show me what companies I have. We then need to copy this. This is our company ID. And we then, if we go here to our another endpoint, you can see this is actually where I've created mine. So I'm using my dev environment, the API, and then I have my my publisher, and I have my demo, my API group, my version. Then I'm saying I need companies, and I want to get my API items. And this is where I put in my company ID. So if I do send here, you can see it gives me my system ID, my number and description. And the reason why of course it gives me that is because on my page here, that is what I've said I wanted. I want my system ID, my number and my description. So that's great. Now I have access to this. So let's take the system ID, and then we have to create a post now. This is to call our bound action. So again, the URL is pretty much the same. We need our companies, and then our API items, and this is where I pass in my system ID for my item. And then here, this is where you actually call your bound action. You do Microsoft.nav and then the function name. Now you might notice here that I have a small lowercase letter starting, and that's very important because even though, as you can see over here, my function actually starts with the uppercase, it will automatically make it a lowercase. So if I try to call this with an uppercase, it's going to fail. So always, no matter what is inside Business Central, always start with a lowercase. Okay, when you start with a lowercase, and then in our body, we say we want to update our unit price. So let's update this to, let's just try something else, like that. And of course, we also have to make sure that we use a token that's valid. And we press send. It says no content, which is a good thing in our case. We then go over here and refresh our item. You can see we have updated our unit price. So that's what's pretty much how you use a bound action. Now, if I want to call my unbound action, I will again go here. This is also a post. My URL is a little bit different here, as you can see. Here I have my tenant ID, then I have my environment name, and then I have the name of my code unit. In this case it's my code unit, but of course you could call your service anything else, but this is my code unit, and then the action on the code unit I want to call, and then in which company and the company ID. And then I might want to change this to another description. Let's call it test. And again, like before, of course we have to make sure that we're using a valid token. And we do send. Says no content, so no errors. If we don't go up here, and let's try to refresh this, we now have a description called my item test. And you see, that's pretty much all there is to working with these APIs. Of course, you can do a lot of different things with them, but the ground principles are pretty much like this. It's very simple, And of course, the only thing you have to keep in mind, because it's kind of a headache, so it might also always be a good idea to start this with a lowercase, because like everything up here, the API pages prefer everything to start with a lowercase, just to make sure, because otherwise you can really get annoyed with having saying, why isn't it working? I'm writing the name of my function, and it's not going to tell you that it's because you have to use a lowercase. It's just going to tell you that it's not working. So always remember that your functions on a bound action has to start with a lowercase. Well, that was pretty much it for this short video. So let's just get back to the last words. So as you can see, it's pretty easy to work with APIs in Business Central. Of course, there is this added layer of complexity when it comes to OAuth, but once it's set up, as you can see, it's not actually that difficult to set up. You're good to go. Of course, you have to remember that this app registration is going to expire, so at some point you're going to have to renew it. And that's of course something you have to keep in mind. But again, that's the security part of it, so no one just has access to your system and you forget about it. It's a way to always make sure that only the right people have access to your system. Now, if you want to read anything about this, there's a link in the description below to the blog post. And until next time, thank you for watching, stay safe, and goodbye.